On a late July morning in 1945, high in the mountains of northern Luzon, the Second World War narrowed down to one barren slope, a ring of caves, and a single American corporal who refused to stay under cover. This is Beyond the Call, Medal of Honor Stories, from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by Trackpads.com. Today we are walking the ridge where Corporal Melvin Mayfield made a lonely climb into converging enemy fire to save pinned-down Filipino soldiers and turn the tide of a stalled attack. Before we continue, I want to mention the Medal of Honor book series that accompanies this work. These books tell the stories of America's Medal of Honor recipients in a serious, readable, and historically grounded format, with each volume focused on a specific campaign, battle, or part of the war. They are available in color paperback, Kindle ebook, and matching audiobook editions. You can find them at militaryauthor.me. To understand what happened on that ridge, it helps to step back to where Mayfield's story began. He was born on the 12th of March, 1919 in the small town of Salem, West Virginia. Like many children of that era, he grew up in a country still shaped by the memory of the First World War and the lean years that followed. As he came of age, the world slid once again toward conflict. By the time he entered the Army during the Second World War, his home of record was Nashport, Ohio, a quiet corner of the American Midwest, far removed from the tropical islands of the Pacific. The Army assigned him to the 20th Infantry Regiment of the 6th Infantry Division. That division, known for its Red Star shoulder patch, had already carved out a hard reputation in the jungles and swamps of New Guinea. From there, it moved on to the Philippines, joining the long and costly campaign to drive Japanese forces from the archipelago and help restore Filipino self-rule. Within the division, Mayfield served in Company D, 1st Battalion, just one infantryman among many grinding through a landscape of steep ridges, dense vegetation, and well-prepared enemy positions. By mid-1945, the focus in the Philippines had shifted to the rugged northern interior of Luzon, where Japanese troops had withdrawn into the mountains rather than surrender. The Cordillera region was a maze of deep valleys and knife-edged ridges. For American and Filipino soldiers, every advance meant climbing exposed slopes, crossing open ground, and rooting enemy forces out of caves and bunkers carved into the rock itself. Even as the war in Europe had ended, the fighting here remained intense, personal, and deadly. On the 29th of July, 1945, two companies of Filipino soldiers moved forward across a barren mountainside toward a circular ridge that dominated the surrounding ground. Their mission was straightforward on paper: close with and destroy the Japanese positions on that high ground. In practice, the moment they advanced, they were met by a violent storm of fire. From the ridge above, rifles and machine guns poured bullets down the slope. Hidden caves and dug-in positions on the upper hillside hurled grenades and added more crossfire. The Filipino formations were quickly pinned. Any attempt to rise from the thin cover of shell holes and rock folds drew immediate, accurate fire. Nearby, American infantry from the 20th Regiment watched the assault falter. Among them was Corporal Melvin Mayfield. From his vantage point on lower ground, he could see the problem with painful clarity. The circular ridge ahead had been turned into a fortress. Enemy positions were sited to cover one another, and the caves along the upper slope acted as strongpoints that anchored the whole defense. As long as those caves remained active, the Filipino companies could not move. The choice in front of him was simple in form and enormous in consequence: stay under cover and hope for another plan, or move forward alone against the positions that were stopping the entire attack. Mayfield chose to move. He did not charge straight up the hill in one sweeping rush. Instead, he began a methodical climb, leaving the relative safety of his position and advancing from shell hole to shell hole. Each crater in the blasted earth gave him a momentary shield from the enemy guns. Between bursts of fire, he sprinted across open patches of dirt and rock, then dropped flat as bullets snapped overhead. Witnesses later described the slope as fire-swept and bare, with no trees or buildings to break the line of sight. In that kind of terrain, any movement stands out starkly. A lone soldier advancing becomes an obvious target, yet he continued to push upward. As he climbed, the distance back to his own lines lengthened, and the short space to the enemy shrank. Infantry training emphasizes working in squads and teams, using coordinated fire and movement. On this ridge, Mayfield effectively found himself alone in the gap between the pinned advance below and the enemy caves above. Dozens of men could only watch from their shallow cover as a single corporal worked his way into the very center of the danger that had stopped them all. Above him, the first of the caves waited, its dark mouth framing the flashes of muzzle fire that had been cutting into the hillside all morning. Once he reached grenade range of that first cave, Mayfield went to work. A cave like this was more than a hole in the rock. It was a carefully chosen position, with a protected chamber inside, firing slits at the entrance, and usually a stock of ammunition and grenades. Mayfield pulled the pin on one of his grenades and threw it into the opening. A moment later, the blast reverberated across the ridge. He drove the attack home with bursts from his carbine, making sure the position was silenced. With that, one of the key guns that had been holding the Filipino soldiers in place went quiet. Silencing a single cave was not enough. The ridge worked as a system of overlapping positions. Mayfield moved laterally along the crest, searching for the next source of fire. 3 more caves formed a rough ring around the top of the hill, each one able to support the others. He repeated his method again and again. Close the distance under fire, throw grenades into the dark interior, then fire into the entrance to finish breaking the position. Each cave he knocked out reduced the weight of fire pouring down the slope. For the soldiers watching below, those sudden gaps in the enemy gun line meant fewer bullets in the air and a renewed chance that the assault might succeed. Before the last hostile position could be neutralized, the defender struck back. A burst from an enemy machine gun found Mayfield. One round destroyed his carbine, shattering his weapon and leaving him without his primary means of fire. Another round tore into his left hand, wounding him and making it difficult even to handle equipment. In most circumstances, losing a weapon and taking a hand wound under close enemy fire would end an assault. The expected response would be to withdraw, seek medical care, and allow another element to continue the fight. Mayfield did not go back. Instead, injured and now unarmed except for what he could carry, he moved just far enough down the hill to secure more grenades. With his left hand wounded, even this simple act took determination. Then he turned once more and climbed back toward the remaining enemy observation post. At near point-blank range, under continued fire, he closed in and used his grenades to destroy the final position. Only when that last threat on the ridge was eliminated did he allow himself to return down the slope. By dismantling the ring of caves one by one, Corporal Mayfield had changed the shape of the entire fight. The Filipino companies that had been pinned in place now faced a weakened defensive line. With the high ground positions silenced, they and their American partners could move forward, consolidate the crest, and secure the area that had so recently been a killing ground. The day's action did not alter the grand strategy of the Pacific War, but on that mountainside it meant the difference between a failed attack and a seized objective, between more casualties and a hard-won foothold. Just weeks after this battle, the wider war in the Pacific came to an end. The fighting that had ravaged Europe had already stopped in May. In August, following the atomic bombings and the decision by Japanese leaders to accept surrender terms, hostilities ceased. Mayfield's climb up a barren Luzon ridge on the 29th of July, 1945, took place in these final, brutal weeks of the conflict. His actions became known as the last combat deed of the Second World War to result in the award of the Medal of Honor before the guns fell silent. The process of recognizing that bravery took time. Commanders gathered reports, interviewed witnesses, and compared accounts to ensure that the recommendation met the strict standards set for the nation's highest military decoration. In May 1946, about 10 months after the fight on the ridge, Corporal Melvin Mayfield received the Medal of Honor. The citation highlighted his gallant determination, his leadership under fire, and the way his lone advance enabled the units around him to complete their mission. It is telling that he left the service still wearing the stripes of a corporal. Medals of honor often go not to those of high rank, but to junior leaders and enlisted soldiers who make split-second decisions in the worst conditions imaginable. When his time in uniform ended, Mayfield did not build a life around public ceremony. He returned to Ohio and stepped back into the rhythms of civilian work. In Licking County, he operated a sawmill, a demanding job that required strength, skill, and long hours. The physical strain and quiet persistence of that work echoed the endurance he had shown in wartime, but now the stakes were measured in board feet of lumber and paychecks, rather than ridges taken and lives saved. Later, he lived in the small community of Frazeysburg, Ohio, far from the jungles and mountains where he had once crawled from shell hole to shell hole under enemy fire. Melvin Mayfield died on the 19th of June, 1990 at the age of 71. He was laid to rest in Frazeysburg Cemetery. His headstone marks him as a Medal of Honor recipient. But, as with so many veterans, the stone cannot convey the full distance between the young man from Salem and Nashport and the soldier on the ridge in Luzon. Nor can it capture the years of quiet life that followed, the unseen labor and family moments that filled his decades after the war. The public part of his story may center on one day in 1945, yet that day was only one chapter in a much longer life. When we look back at Corporal Mayfield's actions now, certain themes stand out. There is the close partnership between American and Filipino forces, fighting together on the same ground, under the same fire. There is the importance of terrain and how a handful of prepared positions can dominate a whole valley until someone finds a way to break them. Above all, there is the image of a single soldier choosing to rise from cover and move forward when every instinct screamed to stay down. He kept going despite the absence of companions at his side, despite the loss of his weapon, and despite his wounds. The ridge he climbed is quiet today, and the caves he silenced are part of history rather than active strongpoints. But the pattern of his decisions remains familiar to anyone who studies or has lived military service. See others in peril, take on risk, and keep pushing until the job is done. By remembering Corporal Melvin Mayfield's journey from West Virginia and Ohio to the mountains of Luzon and back home again, we honor not only his courage but the countless acts of resolve, sacrifice, and steady duty that defined his generation. In telling his story, Beyond the Call stands with the readers, listeners, veterans, and families who keep these memories alive and ensure that days like that one on the Luzon Ridge are never forgotten.